Warning, this video will contain spoilers for The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. If you're looking to experience the game for yourself, I suggest playing and finishing the game on your own time before watching this video. This video is assuming you've already completed the game. The footage for this video was provided by Vinny from Vinesauce. A link to his channel is in the description. Thank you, Vinny. This video would have been delayed for a terribly long time if it weren't for you. So, I finished Breath of the Wild. Those are 7 words I have been waiting to utter since March 3rd. In the roughly 50 hours I had with the game, it was quite the experience. And before I delve into my thoughts about the game, I should make a few disclaimers. The first one being that this comes from my own experiences with the game. What you may have experienced in your own playthrough doesn't necessarily mean that I've experienced it myself. A game as large as this makes it nearly impossible to run into similar scenarios. The second disclaimer is that I'm going to pick this game apart. This includes mentioning everything I liked with the game, as well as everything I didn't like about the game. I'm aware that those who are very fond of this game constantly dismiss problems mentioned by others, with their reasoning either being that the game is intended that way or you're just nitpicking Breath of the Wild because it's a, quote, near-perfect game. If you do perceive this game to be near-perfect, then I'm likely not going to persuade you, nor are you likely going to agree with my to-be-said points in this video. This video is intended for those who love the game, but are willing to see it in a different light. If your mind has been made up, then I suggest watching a different video. Thirdly, I do not list complaints just to be complaining. Yes, I will be listing some problems I have with the game, but it's not out of sheer spite. I'm full aware of the videos in the past I've made regarding this game, and while I do agree with them, I won't let them directly influence how much I enjoy Breath of the Wild. However, any problems I see, large or small, will be addressed. My philosophy has always been to find everything I like as well as everything I don't like with the game. Even my all-time favorite video games aren't an exception to this rule. As much as I'd love to think Spirit Tracks is a perfect Zelda game, I have to come to grips that it's just not because the game has some genuine problems. This may be seen as a metaphorical fun police mentality, but this is just the way I critique games. The reason I bring this mentality up is to prevent the impression that I'm criticizing Breath of the Wild just because it's Breath of the Wild. Considering that this is going to be my biggest video yet, mindlessly bashing the game would not only waste my time, but be a waste of yours as well. The fourth disclaimer is that I may not necessarily find or even have the footage I need for a given point in the video. This footage belongs to Vinny, and in a game as large as this, it's not exactly possible to always display an example of what I'm talking about. This does bother me very much, but there's not really anything I can do about it. The final disclaimer before we start is that you should consider whose video exactly you're watching. You're watching a video produced by an individual who considers Spirit Tracks and Skyward Sword to be masterpieces. No, this is not a joke. I truly believe that these two games, commonly regarded as the absolute worst of the series by the fanbase, sit amongst all other Zelda titles. I'm not trying to encourage you to leave, but if you also believe that Spirit Tracks and Skyward Sword were abysmal, chances are that you aren't going to agree with much I say in this video. You have been notified. Breath of the Wild, or as what we will mostly call it from this point on, Breath, is the 19th installment in the Zelda franchise. Since June, the game boasted to break from tradition that some claim to be wearing out the series. With this information in mind, it is best not to expect your typical Zelda game. The idea in and of itself is honestly not a bad one. A game trying to diversify itself from a predecessor or predecessors can be a good move on a developer's part to keep the quality fresh. However, it is indeed easy to deviate too far from what made said predecessor or predecessors good. In the case of breaking tradition, you want to make the next title familiar yet unfamiliar. If you lean too far into one category, it can become an issue. Make the sequel too familiar, and it will more or less be deemed as a game that played it too safe or a lazy attempt to rake in more finances. Make the sequel too unfamiliar, and you'll likely end up confusing or even frustrating fans of the previous game or games. Most games that have a lot of effort put into them tend to have a certain focus. People who become fans of a game tend to like it because of their focus. and this results in the said focus turning into a standard. You want your fans to feel like they're playing the next installment, not something completely different. The point of delving into all of this is to point out that Breath is a Zelda title that is toying with its own identity. Given how Zelda stands as the 16th most popular video game franchise in the world, stakes here are quite high. Given the sheer amount of people hyped for this game's explicit change of direction, failing to live up to said hype can prove to be a killing blow to the series. Although, it is to be noted that there is also a large amount of general Nintendo fans who will almost always love a Nintendo game no matter how many problems it possesses. I am not trying to disregard every single Nintendo fan's opinion as heavily biased, because that is certainly not true. But there is a gargantuan amount of Nintendo fans who are painfully biased towards nearly any game that the company produces. They are actually the primary reason why I've adopted the mentality of looking about for faults in video games. I myself used to be one of these fans who would attempt to look past most faults of a game to like it more. But in the later years, I found this perspective to be both delusional and unhelpful in the critiquing of a title. I'm not trying to imply that Nintendo fans are the only ones who behave like this. In fact, Sony fans tend to behave in a nearly identical way. But since I've spent nearly my entire life playing Nintendo games, addressing fans of the company is far more relevant to this video. So, in reality, it's actually a rather difficult task to fail the fans of the Breath teasers, because for them, regardless of how the game turns out, the enjoyment factor of the game has practically been preset. So, with all of this kept in mind, I wanted to ignore the excitement surrounding Breath and just come in expecting a Zelda title that wanted to deviate from its predecessors. So, fast forward 8 months after my Defending Linear Zelda Games video to day 2 of the launch, and there was only one question on my mind then, and that question being, was Breath of the Wild worth the wait? The game starts off with you hearing a faint voice in the distance. Over a short period of time, that voice becomes clearer and clearer until you can completely make out the words "open your eyes" being said. This voice is, of course, talking to you. Waking up and not sure what exactly is going on, you follow the voice of the anonymous person and make your way out of the chamber. As you make your way out, the game pans out to give you a good look at the world. You know you're in for a big adventure. Credit where credit is due. Breath of the Wild does a decent enough job of grabbing your attention and making you want to find out what exactly is going on from the get-go. As you make your way down the hill, you spot an old man by a campfire. After exchanging dialogue with the old man and both him and the game giving you a simplified rundown of mechanics, your journey has begun. I figured that the best way to start this review off is to get the least interesting bit of Breath out of the way, the story. Your impression from that last sentence alone should already tell you how I feel about this game's story. It's nothing to write home about. By no means do I hate it, but if there's one thing I'm certain about, it's that this game's story is far from the best. Now, I'll come clean and be completely honest here and say that I didn't track down every single memory in my own playthrough, although I did look the remaining ones up, don't worry. But even when you just play through the campaign, it's just not that good, and for a few reasons. For one, it's an amnesia story. I'm sorry, but while the game did grab my interest in the very beginning, it already lost points here for using such a cliché story mechanic. I do understand that the game wants to have a larger focus on gameplay, but this is such a lazy way to go about it. The game uses Link's amnesia as a way to twist your arm to make you look for your past, rather than just giving you a rundown up front. If you're more of a traditional Zelda player like I am, this feels like a huge slap to the face. The game is already packed full of things to see and do, and the one thing Nintendo could have left in its simple form was the story. Call me impatient if you want, but I like to know exactly what is going on from the get-go. I don't want to have to run around in a gigantic overworld for hours just to understand what went on 100 years ago between me, the 4 champions, and Zelda. But even when you get all of the memories and watch them all in order from beginning to end, the story still feels incomplete. For every next memory, it always feels like there's something missing in between that memory and the one before. This results in the game becoming confusing and seemingly leaves more questions than it does answer. The relationship between Link and the 4 champions is executed in an incredibly poor fashion. Outside of what a few NPCs say and those memories, I barely found a reason to care for any of them. The most I could find with these relationships is that Mipha likes you, Revali seems to see himself as above you, Urbosa is a bit of a motherly figure towards you, and Daruk sees you like any other Goron, a brother. The four champions' relationship with Link didn't make it past show and tell, and that is a real shame, because having them as temporary partners would have not only have been cool, but give them far more time to be appreciated, as opposed to just being story pieces. And that's another general issue with the game's story. It is, as people say, all bark and no bite. Every time I'm seeing a moment in a cutscene, I'm always thinking to myself, gee, it sure would be nice if I could experience that in the game for myself rather than just seeing it. A good example of this is the memory where Zelda is being chased by the Yiga clan assassins. After taking out one of the three, Link has two left to fight. This could have been an in-game moment where you defeat them, and then Zelda possibly regrets that she told you to stop following her some memories back, and thank you, and then follow up with some more dialogue. But instead, the cutscene just ends after Link kills the first assassin. I suppose my biggest gripe with the memories is that I feel like I've been fooled from all the teasers and trailers. I honestly expected to meet and really get to know the four champions and Zelda, and see cool events happen such as seeing the now hostile guardians attack towns and destroy structures, or seeing the divine beasts wreak havoc. However, the game's break from tradition would not allow this. Breath is designed to be a game with instant action in mind. Doing what I would have liked would have likely resulted in a more linear 20 to 30 hour experience where you have to participate in the events before the calamity, and you would have to wait until Link dies to be able to experience the huge open world aspect. I would assume an idea like mine could be worked around, such as making certain parts of the world available for exploration, and then later conserving any unlocks for after your death, where you could then reclaim them. So what about the posthumous story events? Surely they have something to fill in, right? As much as I want this to be true, unfortunately, it's not. You see, the secondary goal is to get the divine beasts back on your side with the help of the spirits of the champions. Each champion has a respective divine beast, with both of each pair being scattered to a different edge of the map. Getting to each pair of course means more story, but the story falls a little flat on its face here because nothing feels connected to each other in the slightest. Breath feels more like a game featuring a guy who does some things as opposed to a Zelda game. This is why I was hoping that at least the main story quests were lined up in a linear fashion, because an organized story will always trump an unorganized one. There is no argument there. Rather than meeting someone a part of a race, helping them out, and then being directed by them to obtain something, or them telling you to give their regards to someone else a part of another race so you can continue the story, the game basically goes, just pick whatever, and then stops. This kind of structure feels like it's taking you nowhere. Again, Breath's drive for instant action is to blame for all of this. I understand that this game wanted to be vastly different from its predecessors, but there's just some things from previous games that are better left untouched. If you want it changed like this so bad, you shouldn't have labeled this as a Zelda game, because this kind of problem makes Breath look like it just doesn't know what it's doing. As for the ending, well, let's just say that I haven't been this disappointed from an ending in a Zelda game in 7 years. Yes, the last time I was disappointed by an ending in a Zelda game was when I was 10 years old. If you're wondering what that game was, it was Phantom Hourglass. The ending of that game was just beyond unsatisfying and feels like a cop-out, not to mention it's just confusing. Breath's ending is comparable to Zelda 1. The game just kind of goes, hey look, you beat Ganon, you're a hero of Hyrule, and then goes to a credit screen that, have you mind, doesn't show the aftermath of Ganon's defeat, but just does the show a bunch of pictures from moments in the game cliche. There is a bonus scene after the words "the end" show up, but not only is it a low-key copy off of the Wind Waker's ending, but it's a solid setup for DLC, which will bother me to no end. The reason I'm not upset at Zelda 1's ending is because it's an NES game, and that game has limitations that it simply cannot overcome to deliver an ending that is as satisfying as, say, Ocarina of Time's ending or Majora's Mask's ending. Zelda 1's situation is understandable and forgivable. Breath, on the other hand, is a 2017 game, and when your 1986 predecessor has an ending more complete than yours, you have seriously screwed up. Some people try to dismiss these story issues by simply saying, I've never played Zelda games for the story anyway, or Zelda games have never had that good of a story anyway, but that just results in me dismissing their dismissal because most Zelda games, even the more gameplay-focused top-down games, have a focus on building up story, and people in the past praised these games for doing so. Honestly, it seems like it's just easier to accept that this is a genuine problem rather than trying to generalize the issue. Breath's story is a metaphorical NES video game manual, and if they want to make a good structured story, they're going to have to stop the instant action. Whether or not this is fixed next time around is left up to Nintendo. My final issue with the story that I must mention before moving on is that the voice acted cutscenes are just beyond awkward. Zelda, along with the other champions, are busy speaking these full sentences while Link just stares at them like a complete idiot. This is the exact same issue that Xenoblade Chronicles X suffered from, and it's just uncomfortable and makes you wish that the NPCs were using speech bubbles again. This is not my biggest gripe, but it is still a problem nonetheless. I'd be lying if I said that the Legend of Zelda series as a whole is really hard. The difficulty really depends on the game. Some titles will make you earn finishing them, while others either don't have enemies powerful enough to slay you or they simply don't throw a lot at you at a time. While I do love a good challenge, I've never really seen the lack of difficult situations as an actual problem, because most games have combat that's satisfying regardless of whether or not it's easy. A good example of this is the Minish Cap. I didn't die a single time playing that game, yet I still recall very much enjoying fights with foes such as the Dark Nuts. It's the sheer excitement that keeps me attached to fights, not whether or not the enemy can down me in a few hits. Of course, combat isn't the only factor that determines whether or not I like a Zelda game, but it does play a part. However, other Zelda fans say otherwise. There is a group of people who genuinely believe that previous Zelda titles should have went down a Dark Souls path and become brutally difficult. On a side note, I do find it a bit comedic that the creator of Dark Souls actually found this to be sort of an insult to the Zelda series, believing that the Zelda franchise's overall difficulty is not a problem and shouldn't be compared to his own series. But since Breath wants to conform to the public's plea for an incredibly hard game, they decided to up the difficulty, in one of the sloppiest forms I've ever seen. But before I go on, let me clear something up first. I don't have an issue with a Zelda game being notably harder than other titles. A good example of this is Ocarina of Time 3D's Master Quest. This version contains a flipped overworld, notably more difficult puzzles, and twice the damage from all sources. All of a sudden, enemies like the Stalfos require more caution, with his standard attack taking out 2 hearts and his jump strike taking out 4. Foes like the Iron Knuckles don't tolerate mistakes, taking out a whopping 8 hearts in one solid hit. Breath is a different story. Rather than making enemies just deal standard high damage, they typically take out more than half of your hearts in a single blow. If it's not that, then they just wipe you out in a solid hit. Consider the fact that enemies can hit you back to back and it becomes questionable. The problem here is that unlike the Master Quest, which is brutal but gives you time to understand enemies, Breath can just kill you in no time flat without giving you much time to get oriented. Even when I upgraded my armor to better handle the stronger enemies, it seemed as if nothing had changed at all. While you do learn to leave a certain group of enemies alone, you won't learn much in terms of how to handle them. Breath also has the nerve to include an incredibly unfair super armor. If you don't know what super armor is, it's a common mechanic found in games that prevents either the player or the enemy from flinching, staggering, or even falling down from an attack. Super armor is typically achieved either through an upgrade or by executing a certain action. Breath's super armor is random and can catch you off guard. If you've played games such as Mortal Kombat 9 and fought the tougher opponents, this should sound familiar. From what I've seen, there's no way to predict when an enemy will just shake off an attack. This results in them simply getting hit without flinching and almost instantly responding with an attack that you can't block or dodge because you're in your recovery frames. Now, it'd be understandable for super armor to kick in for enemies if you're just wailing on them and the game wants to give the enemy a chance to retaliate, but this can happen as soon as your first strike on them. I found myself getting incredibly frustrated at this game because there would be times where I think I could have the enemy locked for a few hits, just for them to shake off my attacks and come in with a swing that knocks out all of my health and takes me to the game over screen. This is the primary reason why I dislike using greatswords in this game. They deal nice damage, but believe it or not, even enemies such as the Bokoblins could just shake off the 2-hit combo. I could live with them being able to super armor the first hit to prevent greatswords from becoming overpowered, but both hits? Breath is one of 2 games I've played to make greatswords not so great, the other game being Monster Hunter Generations. Also, I must ask, why can you no longer control the direction in which you swing? Removing this was just a bad choice. You see, enemies have a habit of swarming you in Breath. That of course means that they can come from your left, your right, or behind you. While you can't do much about enemies showing up behind you, you should at least be able to handle the ones from your left and your right. If there are some rather threatening foes to my right, I want to be able to hold left and swing from my right to ensure that I hit them first. I also cannot understand for the life of me why Breath also removed the thrust attack. The thrust attack was good for attacking enemies at a slightly safer distance as well as allowing you to strike them quicker. Heck, even the 2D titles had a form of the thrust attack. It is true that the spear now takes the place of the thrust attack, but the spear suffers from the problem of not being able to swing left and right. It's a spear. I don't see why you wouldn't be able to use the handle as a way to batter enemies. Yes, technically the removal of the manual left and right swinging as well as the thrust attack technically doesn't change much, but it makes Breath's combat as a whole feel more brain dead. If this game were a 2D Zelda title, I wouldn't care as much, because the 2D titles favor the more brain-dead form of combat. But changing this in a 3D Zelda makes it feel not like a 3D Zelda. The 3D series is known for its sword combat having more options, so the sudden removal of this just feels awkward. And it took me hours to get used to the fact that adjustable combat swings were no longer a thing. If anything, the combat should have adopted a combat style more like Skyward Sword's. I'm not referring to the use of a Wiimote, but rather how enemies would alternate their sword gestures to prevent you from hitting them. Skyward Sword actually gave a lot more purpose to swinging left and right and thrusting, but as I mentioned in the previous video, Breath is apparently avoiding the so-called mistakes that Skyward Sword made, so there's little hope of seeing that style of combat ever return. So what does Breath have to offer in place of these odd removals? Well, you have a notably more punishing version of Skyward Sword's parrying and a bullet time-like system that seems to only work when it feels like it. Although I do feel that the parrying could just be a little more forgiving, I do like that it's actually less forgiving than Skyward Sword's, as before it felt unrealistic even for Zelda standards. Parrying in Breath does indeed feel satisfying, and you do feel a bit unstoppable once you get the hang of it. But the bullet time, I'm sad to say that this feature has issues. The bullet time works in 2 different ways. One way to do it is to jump off from somewhere and pull out your bow, and in this moment you can shoot arrows with little to no retaliation. The only factor limiting this feature being your stamina. This variant of the bullet time actually works just fine. It's the other one that has the problems. The other mechanic is the side jumping or back flipping out of the way of an attack perfectly or near perfectly. When you successfully do so, you are given the opportunity to strike at enemies several times with absolutely nothing to stop you until the bullet time runs out. This works only about half the time. There have been countless times where I know for a fact I jumped out of the way perfectly or at least enough for the bullet time to activate, but the game just doesn't acknowledge that I did so and the bullet time either doesn't activate or I end up getting hit. This seems to happen the most when I'm fighting a Lionel. For being an enemy that painfully telegraphs their attacks and has one of the most predictable patterns I've ever seen, bullet time oddly enough seems to work the least here. The common one-handed sword variant is the easiest out of all the Lionels to understand. You wait for him to swing and you just backflip 1 to 3 times. But even if it's not the one-handed sword variant, it's very easy to figure out which attacks will activate the bullet time, and they all keep the exact same charging attack that can activate it. So even if you couldn't figure out one variant, that one you are guaranteed to find. But you would not believe how many times I've been one-shotted by a Lionel just because the bullet time did not kick in. I especially find it strange that it's not very responsive at times with this foe because when the bullet time does work, it's actually incredibly forgiving. Speaking of Lionels, I'm aware that these centaur-like creatures have always been known to be one of the tougher foes in the Zelda series, but making them incredibly powerful enemies that have a good chance of one-shotting you is just the laziest way to go about it. The issue never really seems to go away either, because the game does scale up as you go through it. So there's really no way to have an advantage other than getting some items or abilities for later. Other fights like the Molduga just confuses me. You're supposed to leave it vulnerable by leaving a bomb in front of it as it's chasing you so you can detonate a bomb inside of its mouth. Sometimes the Molduga just skips over the bomb and just heads straight towards you, likely resulting in you either getting instantly killed or at least taking heavy damage from his biting attack. It's a shame because this is definitely one of the more eye-catching fights this game has to offer. Breath seems to be one of those games where doing something even just a little off will result in the game not recognizing what you're trying to do. But the one thing that always seems to get me is the arrows. Yes, not the Molduga or the gargantuan hulking beast that is the Lionel, but arrows. I understand that it's a slick and little point of metal that is piercing your skin, but these things really test my patience at times. It seems that no matter what bow or what enemy is using said bow, they all seem to deal extremely high damage or just drop you altogether. Thankfully though, the foes that carry these bows tend to be really weak, regardless of how far in you are. Oh yeah, and don't think you can save during a fight so you can save some progress, because all the game will do is put you where you last saved and respawn all of the enemies, doing nothing but making your life harder. Also, the ragdolling. There is no other way to put this. I utterly detest the ragdoll physics. Like, this feature in the game brings down my entire feelings for it, kind of detest. Unless Nintendo fixes this for the next title, I seriously never want to see this feature show up in the series ever again. The ragdoll physics in the game are just far too sensitive. It seems like the slightest decline causes your body to build up an insane amount of momentum and just shoot off in a direction. To make matters worse, your body can stack up damage as you're sliding and or rolling off somewhere, and there's really not much you can do about it other than magically eat food as your body is moving off in an undesired direction. It also doesn't help that the enemy ragdolls can get in your way. This isn't necessarily an issue in normal fights, but I've found that fighting the incarnations of Ganon is where it becomes most noticeable. The head is of course a spot you want to land most of your hits at, but there's actually been a few moments where I've been cheated a few hits because the arm of an incarnation just got in the way. Even if you want to look past the issues of the ragdolling, it just looks really lazy. To be fair, there are a few foes who have animations before they ragdoll, such as the Lionel, the Hinox, and the Guardians, and of course, the bosses. But the rest of the enemies' bodies just become instantly limp the moment all of their health is lost. The only enemy I can understand instantly ragdolling is the Keese, because it's constantly in the air. But I digress, let's get back to talking about the difficulty in combat. I'm aware that there is more than one way you can approach a fight, but honestly most of them seem like a waste of time or they just aren't satisfying. Either some tactics just take too long and you'd be better off fighting them directly or with a bow, or they seem only good for handling a certain enemy or a group of enemies. If it isn't the explosive barrels or sometimes the incredibly helpful stealth takeouts, chances are I want nothing to do with it. So at this point, I'm sure that some of you are saying, the game isn't cheap, you're just bad at the game. I beg to differ. I do feel that the game is cheap and that it doesn't know what it's doing. I've played harder games that were more fair than Breath. Dark Souls anybody? G-Rank Quest and level 140 Guild Quest in Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate perhaps? I have lost count of the amount of times I fainted in battle in 4 Ultimate. But the thing that keeps me going is the fact that it was completely my fault. Breath's lightning quick one-hit kill attacks, half responsive bullet time, and out of nowhere one-shot arrows almost always feels like it was out of my control. And constantly knowing that it wasn't your fault results in the game becoming boring. Now, there are the 4 blessings you can attain from the 4 champions, but these actually don't help that much at all. Regardless of how much they help, they do make the game a little more tolerable, so I should at least be thankful for that. But overall, if games of higher difficulty can remain fair, then there isn't much of a reason Breath shouldn't be able to do the same. If we go strictly by objective principles, yes, Breath of the Wild is by far the hardest Zelda game in the series. However, as far as I'm concerned, the 3DS Master Quest is still the best example of high difficulty in a Zelda game. If the new Hard Mode DLC just makes enemies borderline one-hit kills, then I'm not even going to bother because that's just a further spiral into bad game design. Breath's music is actually very well made. Although some songs can get obnoxiously repetitive and the soundtrack has more use of a piano than I like, those are just nitpicks. The game's soundtrack has a lot of effort put into it, dare I say giving Skyward Sword a run for its money. Battle songs greatly capture the mood and excitement of a fight, especially fights like the Molduga. Hyrule Castle's theme is just awesome, and the town themes, especially Hateno Village's, is very pleasant to listen to. I would say that Kakariko Village's theme is the best one, but they've tampered with the iconic theme far beyond recognition, and it's actually my least favorite town theme now, unfortunately. The only problems I have regarding music is the lack of any on the file select / DLC menu, and the lack of constant music on the overworld. No music on the file select menu is just plain weird, and the lack of constant music on the overworld is just unacceptable. Yes, I agree with people that the music on the overworld doesn't have to be large and grand like in other games, but most of the time it's just silence, and that's boring. But when the music does kick in, it's really quiet, and it annoys me that there's no way to turn it up. And considering the variety of places you can go and see, it seems like a lot of opportunity was wasted. Breath could have had an overworld theme at a decent volume that was very calm and peaceful, and maybe even altered depending on where you were, such as entering a forest with a variety of leaf colors, or the music becoming a bit more muffled and having an increase in reverb when you entered a cave. But alas, this is not what we got. I understand that the game's overworld music is barely present and very quiet in order to make itself far more immersive, but in my opinion, it just makes the game feel a lot more dead compared to other titles, and overall, sort of kills my vibe to explore this ginormous world. I do feel that music has a very large impact on how much you can enjoy a game, but in most cases, it's really not that big of a deal. Especially for a video like this, where there's much more bigger problems to address. We're stepping on some sensitive ground here. The Dungeons of the Zelda series is one of the primary reasons why I stick around with it. I just adore the idea of going into a dangerous place while grabbing keys, fighting foes, and solving puzzles. Considering how large Breath is, failing to deliver with the dungeons can really take a stab in my liking of the game. Does the game succeed in making the dungeons fun? In regards to shrines, kind of. But as for the divine beasts, absolutely not. Like, they don't even come close to being good. All of the divine beasts suffer from the exact same issue. They're really empty, only have about 2 to 3 enemies, and almost solely focus on gimmicks. It becomes apparent at this point that dungeons were given very little regard in the 5+ years of the development cycle. And it really bothers me because the divine beasts themselves are incredibly fascinating. You're entering a gigantic robot to activate its terminal so you can get it back on your side. How can you not like that concept? Unfortunately, the concept is the best part of the divine beasts. Once you get the map of a divine dungeon, as I'll call them from now on, you may instantly notice something. The dungeon maps in this game are abysmal. Someone over at Nintendo HQ apparently thought it was a good idea to make 3-dimensional maps that turn when you turn the camera. It also doesn't help that everything but the marked terminals on the 3D maps are all blue, making it hard to pinpoint exactly where you are or even what direction you're facing. This makes using the map incredibly awkward, and it does nothing but show just how much better the maps from older titles were. The emptiness of dungeons is something I thought was left back in Twilight Princess. A decent amount of dungeons in Twilight Princess just felt like they were much bigger than what they needed to be, and it feels like potential was being wasted. However, at least those spacey dungeons were actually still good dungeons. Breath barely even tries. There's the already mentioned severe lack of enemies, the okay puzzles that revolve around messing with whatever the divine dungeon gimmick is, and the fact that every single divine dungeon looks exactly the same, and they're really short lengths. Again, it is a real shame that these dungeons aren't good, because the idea of exploring a giant robot while being able to go outside and see the overworld is one of the most creative things this game has done. Divine Dungeons Va Meadow and Va Nobodis are undoubtedly the coolest ones of the 4, because Va Meadow is basically an airship, complete with a glass floor you can look down to see it flying over the overworld in real time, and Va Nobodis is a giant camel robot that walks around the Gerudo Desert, complete with you being able to go outside and see all the mountains and structures below passing by. I have to give credit where credit is due. Both of these dungeons are some of the coolest things I've ever seen in a Zelda game, period. It makes me wish they were a lot longer so I could really take the time to appreciate how good they are. But sadly, there was not much effort put in aside from some puzzles and the aesthetic appeal. So what about the bosses of each dungeon? Surely they have to be good, right? Oh wait, you mean the Water Blight, Wind Blight, Thunder Blight, and Fire Blight Ganon incarnations, right? aka use the bomb arrows / special arrows to win incarnations. Yes, even the dreaded Thunderblight Ganon is exploitable with bomb arrows, and I defeated him in no time flat. You could say, using the arrows is optional so it's not bad game design. But that's like saying locking some of the upgrades in Doom 4 behind secrets isn't bad because it's optional. Sure, you don't need to find all the secrets in order for Doom 4 to be satisfying, but that does not change the idea that it's still bad game design. Once you discover that all you need is a good bow and some arrows to defeat these incarnations, all 4 bosses arguably become some of the easiest bosses in the entire series. I didn't use the bow the entire time in any of the fights, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't using it most of the time. It doesn't help much either that every single dungeon as well as every single incarnation of Ganon all look universally the same. Even Calamity Ganon himself looks incredibly similar to the Elemental Ganons. Heck, the first phase of the final boss fight is literally a combination of all 4 fights before mashed up into one. That is just beyond lazy and there's no excuse for that. And the second phase is arguably worse. Beast Ganon is no challenge whatsoever and it just feels like an excuse to put the light arrows in the game. But let's get back to the dungeons here. It goes without saying that the Divine Dungeons, in general, are very low quality. I find it utterly baffling that Nintendo would put all this time into crafting a unique overworld, yet they somehow don't know how to make a good dungeon anymore. Normally, I would be a lot nicer about a bad dungeon, because there have been some not so great dungeons in the past, but it seems like Nintendo put very little effort into Breath's major dungeons, which, when you consider how long this game has been in development for, just looks extremely lazy, and there is simply no way I can get behind that. However, despite how much I dislike the final boss, Hyrule Castle, the final dungeon in Breath, is the only major dungeon I actually kind of like. It's far from the best final dungeon I've played in any Zelda game, but it's still good at least. I just wish it was much longer, threw in a variety of puzzles, and didn't focus so much on fighting Guardians and Lynels to progress through it. But as you know, there's that group of people who would try virtually any argument they can think of to keep Breath on top of its platinum platter. A common rebuttal I've seen that I honestly cannot even believe exists in the first place is the argument that dungeons in the Zelda series were never that good in the first place. I understand that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but I would really have to question why you would think that. There is no such thing as something being objectively good, but you don't feel that there's just a few games that have a good set of dungeons? The Zelda series has cycled through several teams over the years, and there's not one game with a set of dungeons you like? Considering how much people have praised Zelda games in the past for having very good dungeons, I just cannot believe that the vast majority thinks that the dungeons in general are okay. I've heard people praise Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, and heck, even Zelda 1's dungeons have gotten praise. To suddenly shift attitudes like this and say that the series' dungeons have never been that good just makes me suspicious of the idea that those who say this don't want to accept that Breath is not perfect. I don't mean to take a stab at the audience here, but I figure it'd just be better to be completely honest. But let's keep the wheels rolling and move on. How are the Shrine Trials? If I were to be completely honest, they're very good. No jokes here. I truly believe that the Shrine Trials are actually some of the best parts of the game. Except for the trials that have a large focus on the game's awful physics, or the ones involving the gyroscope feature. I didn't enjoy those in the slightest. They sometimes have me sit down and really think about how I should solve some puzzles, or they simply want me to observe my surroundings to find the solution. This is what I wanted the Divine Dungeons to be. I wanted a good challenge involving the tools given to me, not a 30-minute location with nearly all puzzles revolving around the gimmick of the dungeon. Manipulating the features of the Sheikah Slate runes, thinking outside of the box, and the tests of strength all gave me that good old classic feeling I love so much in older Zelda titles. I only have a few issues with the shrines. The first issue with the shrines being that they all look exactly the same, and have the exact same music playing in the background. Considering how much personality these puzzles and arenas have, it feels like a bit of an insult to the shrines themselves for having the same slick black and beige color scheme, accompanied by the same blue lighting and ominous music that honestly seems to better fit entering a cave. My second issue is that there's a certain lack of satisfaction. I really miss using items like the hookshot and iron boost to make my way through a dungeon. It doesn't necessarily have to be those two, but you get what I mean. It would have made every dungeon stand out even more than what they already do, and even if the special items were exclusive to shrines only, I felt that would have been a lot better. My final issue with the shrines is that they're incredibly short. They feel like small bursts of fun, and I would really like for them to last a lot longer. I personally believe that it would have been a better choice to only have 20 shrines, but they're all well thought out as opposed to 120 dungeons with most of them barely lasting 5 minutes. The shrines feel like they're demos of greater dungeons, and it really feels like Nintendo could have taken several of these shrines and put them together to make one big shrine. To be completely honest, although the vast majority of shrines are amazing, the overall dungeon scene in Breath is just a huge disappointment. This is the biggest Zelda game in the entire series, yet you're telling me the best Nintendo could do was 4 of some of the worst major dungeons I've ever seen in a Zelda game, 1 pretty good dungeon, and a bunch of 5-minute mini dungeons? The world of Zelda is bustling with dungeons, temples, fortresses, and others of the like. So what's Breath's excuse for not having any full-blown bonus dungeons? Yes, Calamity Ganon is a force to be reckoned with, and he really did tear Hyrule to pieces, but that's no excuse. Nintendo could have worked off of the ideas of making every single bonus dungeon ruins. But yet, here we are with nothing but a world that feels like a waste of great opportunity. If Breath of the Wild wanted to be a Skyrim killer, then it should have acted like it and done more than just make a fully open world. Yes, I just went there, and I don't intend to be rude, but I'm not sorry that I said that. Say what you want about the Elder Scrolls V with its bugs, its glitches, and its questionable AI, but at least the game took time to add bonus dungeons that were more than 5 minutes long. Take it from a guy who isn't even that big of a Bethesda fan. Let's hope that this DLC dungeon that Breath is proposing is actually worth your time and doesn't make the same mistake that the main game did with its Divine Dungeons. While the previous sections of this video were a combination of satisfactions and dissatisfactions, this section in particular will be referring to the overall game and other miscellaneous factors. However, keep in mind that I, myself, am not very fond of the open world genre. I'm the type of individual who prefers a more structured experience rather than the game telling me to make my own. This is not to say that every time a game does this that it bothers me. Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate is one of those few exceptions where I don't mind the game letting me decide my own experience. Then again, 4 Ultimate is more or less a non-linear game with open world elements, so there is that to consider. My taste in what makes a good Zelda game to me mostly comes from my mother, because she was simply the one who got the Zelda game and we would sit down and play the game together. This is just a bit of an anecdote in case you become curious as to why some of these to-be-said points are the way they are. Breath's largest focus of satisfaction is undoubtedly the incredibly large overworld and its offer of variety in approaching scenarios. These two factors alone is why many have considered Breath to be one of, if not the best Zelda game in the entire series. Some even claim that Breath is the Zelda game we always needed, or that this is the natural direction that Zelda should have went in decades ago. Do I agree with either of these points? Unsurprisingly, no. I personally feel that if I agree with either of these, I'd be insulting the series as a whole. There's been a lot of great Zelda games in the past, and to dismiss them just because they aren't open world, or at least not as open-ended as Zelda 1, doesn't seem like a good mentality to maintain. But let's talk about Breath itself. How satisfying is the game? Let's start with one of the game's most noticeable changes, breakable items. This mechanic is actually far from new for the Zelda series. In fact, it's nearly 20 years old. But it wants to make a comeback as a major feature in Breath. Now, let me just come out and say that I'm not really against the idea of weapons breaking in an RPG. If done right, it can be tolerable and actually an enjoyable mechanic. Breath of the Wild is not one of those games. The first thing I noticed when I first experienced breaking items is that they break very frequently. Around the beginning of the game, most weapons last about 5 to 10 hits, and near the end, it's about 15 to 40. But even 15 to 40 hits is an incredibly short span for weapons. Bows are a different story with durability, and I honestly couldn't tell you for the life of me how durable they are from beginning to end, because they all just kinda felt the same to me. Except for the Lionel bow. Those do last a noticeably longer time than the other bows. It does bother me a bit that weapons never really feel like they're getting any stronger. While you will still run into weaker foes now and then, the enemies in general get tougher and tougher before ultimately becoming metaphorical damage sponges. Because the scaling mechanic is the way it is, it typically feels like you're stuck at square one. The weapons were apparently intended to break frequently so you could stay on your toes, but personally I detest this mechanic, and I found myself getting more annoyed with it rather than satisfied with scattering about looking for another weapon. I also failed to understand why there is absolutely no way you can repair any of your items. Breath is supposed to be a Zelda game with survival elements tacked onto it. So why is it that one of the most important survival elements, repairing and maintaining an item's durability, not in the game at all? And why is it that you cannot see how close your weapon is to breaking? The most the game does is just alarm you that your item is close to breaking and said item starts flashing red. And it's just frustrating knowing that your item is going to break and there's not a single thing you can do about it. One can say what they will about this, but there's no excuse for this at all. Especially considering the fact that Skyward Sword, a game with breakable shields, gives you the option to repair them if they take a lot of damage. Keep in mind that Skyward Sword is an origin story that takes place before all other Zelda games, so it technically has the most primitive version of a civilization in the entire series. Yet, here we are in Breath, a game that takes place several thousands of years after Skyward Sword, a world that, have you mind, contains great fairies, scientists, and of the like, but yet nobody seems to be able to repair items. It's the problems like this that make me question just how much thought did Nintendo put into this mechanic. It truly feels like Breath just doesn't know what it's doing at times. So with these problems kept in mind, no, I am not satisfied with the breakable weapons in this game. Considering the fact that enemies scale up as you make your way through the game, I would have preferred a much more traditional RPG approach to the weapon drops where weapons can only be useful for so long before they become irrelevant. Over that time until it has lost its relevance, you can really take the time to appreciate that item. So when you're say 10 hours down the road, and time comes to part with that item, you've had time to really appreciate it. I wouldn't even mind if Breath took a Borderlands-like approach where there's a bunch of mediocre weapons to find, but every once in a while you'll find an awesome one. But unfortunately, this is not what we got. This sort of corresponds back to what I said in August in my video elaborating my thoughts on Breath of the Wild. In that video, I mentioned how the bond between you and the sword would likely be broken in this game. And while it isn't just swords we're dealing with here, this is undoubtedly the type of issue I was worried would arise. Every time I see a really cool sword, spear, greatsword, etc., I always get really excited but then quickly snap out of it and remember that this item is going to be short-lived and I shouldn't grow attached to it. This especially hurts when you find an item that either has a special stat or said item is incredibly rare. Being aware of the fact that you can't repair these awesome items does nothing but invoke a hoarder mentality. In my own experience, I've found myself being too scared to use my awesome items in my inventory and would intentionally scatter about areas just to find a normal item. When I had to use one of my amazing items, I always had the absolutely awful feeling on the inside that I was wasting it, even if I was fighting a powerful foe. This especially happened several times near the end of my run, and to me, it took a lot out of the fun factor. You can buy a house in Breath, which can somewhat help with the hoarding mentality by allowing you to store items there, but even that has problems. You can only store 3 types of weapons, 3 types of shields, and 3 types of bows. That's a ridiculously small amount of items that the house can hold at one time, so it barely serves as a solution for keeping your more important items there. And one thing that has definitely confused me throughout my playthrough regarding breakable weapons is that even the classics such as the Fire Rod and the Ice Rod can break, and considering that they aren't even good for every scenario, I don't see why those items should even break in the first place. Heck, even the Master Sword and Hylian Shield can break. And if you've played more than one Zelda game, specifically other games like Skyward Sword, you know this just doesn't make sense. Both the Master Sword and Hylian Shield apparently can be misused, and so they conserve their holy energy, aka extreme durability, for dungeons and guardian fights. I will admit though, using the Master Sword when its holy energy is activated makes an incredibly loud pang noise, and it's really satisfying to see the bright white flash accompanied by the impactful sound. However, that's just one weapon. But overall, this is not to say that I still don't enjoy the weapons, but I can't enjoy them nowhere near as much as I would like to. Boomerangs just frustrate me to no end. I've never been that big of a fan of the boomerang in general, yet somehow Breath managed to find a way to tamper with it and take me from I don't care for the item to I despise the item. They can be used as battering items, which at least that works fine, but their actual functions is something that, for the most part, causes more stress than it does satisfaction. For one, it is incredibly easy to lose them. Boomerangs this time around can hit surfaces and fall off somewhere. They also have to be manually caught this time around, a new mechanic that's surprisingly easy to screw up on. Moving around after throwing a boomerang just runs an even higher risk of the boomerang bouncing off somewhere, so if something happens to where you really need to move, you may have to embrace it bouncing off somewhere. As mentioned before, the physics in this game aren't good at all. So again with the declines, your boomerang can just zip right off a cliff with you never seeing it again. Speaking of items, what happened to the classic item system? You can't sit there and call this game a homage to Zelda 1, yet ignore one of its most iconic additions. I miss the good old times when you had to use specific items to traverse the land. It gave the games a great sense of progression and was incredibly satisfying. After you get off the Great Plateau, you pretty much have all you need for getting around. The only other factors limiting where you can explore is the clothes you're wearing and your stamina. Tell me, viewer, what sounds more satisfying? Using, say, a hookshot, mole mitts, or a whip to get somewhere, or just climbing there, something you could do since the very start of the game. This is the problem that comes with this instant action mentality that Breath has such a large focus on. There's very little sense that you're actually getting somewhere. And this may be my linear favoring mind speaking here, but it feels like you're just fooling around as opposed to actually doing something productive. Don't get me wrong, pretty much every Zelda game has that moment where it feels like you're just messing about, but I've never had that feeling as many times as I did in Breath. As a result, I found myself getting bored and wanting to go back along the main quest line. Another part of the problem of me getting bored is the fact that the world feels so needlessly large. I felt that if Nintendo had even shrank down the world to half its size, it would have been a lot more tolerable. But these constant moments where there's just a big space of nothing bothers me. I'm not saying that I'm looking to be satisfied with every single step that I take in the game, but the traversing in these open spaces just becomes tiring. Yes, there are horses to make travel quicker, but believe it or not, I cannot stand the way they reworked horse riding. Apparently, it's been redesigned to better simulate the behavior of a real horse, but whatever Nintendo did just felt awkward beyond belief. In my time with using the horses, even once I raised their affection to higher levels, the horses just seemed like they had a hard time turning left or right. Sometimes the horses felt the need to just lock up the controls and just move in one solid direction. Making horse controls worse than Ocarina of Time seems like it takes a lot more effort to do as opposed to just not doing it, but somehow it has been done. There is also just the smaller things that bother me, such as rain limiting where you can climb. It seems to always happen specifically when I'm climbing something tall, and it annoys me to no end, and the almighty fun killer that is the thunderstorms. I hate these more for the fact that any object currently equipped on you that is either electric or made of metal attracts lightning. My best equipment was usually made of metal, so it's rather easy to understand why I absolutely loathe thunderstorms. Side quests are also far from the best from what I've seen in the Zelda series. It's always collect some type of consumable or material to get a generic reward, or kill X amount of enemies also for a generic reward. Other Zelda games have had the collect an item to get a reward type of side quest, but the difference with those games is that they had you look for something unique, and you actually got a reward that was actually worth your time. Anybody who's played Minish Cap, Skyward Sword, or A Link Between Worlds should know what I'm talking about. Just because Breath is bigger doesn't mean that it's instantly better. More options and variety also does not equal instantly better. Monster Hunter Generations is a fine example of this. That game offered a large sum of ways a battle could play out, yet the game is painfully easy. Monster Hunter is a series where difficulty is a major focus, and thus, I think games like 4 Ultimate and games before are vastly superior. Now, I don't want to just completely dismiss the game as unsatisfying. Certain mechanics, such as cooking, is something I actually grew rather attached to. Considering that the mechanic seems to be, for the most part, limited by only your creativity, it's actually very fun to explore around and see what kind of food you can make or how potent you can make a buff from a dish. Although, I don't really like the fact that the game pretty much forces you to go out and get ingredients, because there's pretty much no other way to heal yourself effectively without having to gather a bunch of food first. But that's pretty much the only issue I have with it. I also absolutely love the shield surfing. That mechanic is honestly one of the most fun things I've ever done in a Zelda game. Dare I say, it's my favorite way of traversing the overworld in any Zelda game period. During my run, I was always itching to find something steep enough for me to ride my shield down on. If I saw that an enemy camp was on a spiraling hill or mountain, I would go all the way up there, fight the monsters, and then surf all the way down. Yes, I really do like it that much. When I'm not running into the problems I had with the combat, it can actually be pretty fun. Some problems are just there to stay, but it was still enjoyable to a degree. There were also some moments that gave me a good laugh as well, such as seeing a moblin accidentally jump off a cliff, or throwing your items at a monster and seeing them get flung across the field. However, I feel it's about time to wrap things up here. For a game that considers itself to be a huge homage to Zelda 1 and is intended to take inspiration from it, it sure doesn't feel like it overall. Rather than keeping the story intact and offering a bunch of bonus dungeons, Breath takes it upon itself to do a complete 180 from what made the previous game so good and just go back to square one. That does nothing but make your game appear to be primitive to previous titles. Look, I don't want Breath to look like it's the worst game made in the existence of man, because truth be told, it's far from it. There are far worse examples out there, such as Triforce Heroes, the ambitiously awful game No Man's Sky, or the more recent Mass Effect Andromeda. But truthfully, my biggest motivation for even making this video in the first place is because of the fact that almost nobody's addressing these problems, and the people like me who do bring up the problems end up getting bashed by people who just want the game to remain in this constant state of perfection. I can't really say that I'm surprised at this, because pretty much every Zelda game is regarded as the best one in the series around launch. Although, something is definitely up with the Breath fanbase because it's the only side of the Zelda fanbase I've seen that has caused enough ruckus to the point where they were sending a well-known reviewer death threats and hacking his website. But I digress. This game is, by no means, bad. It has enough intact to be considered a good game. But it seems like every time I find myself enjoying the game, a problem comes along and just kills my mood. If you strictly live by the fact that this game is extremely open-ended and full of options, then the game is perfect. However, for players like me, that was not the case. This is the first time I've played a Zelda game and got so fed up with its problems to the point where I blatantly stated, alright, that's it, I don't want to play this game anymore. I had already cleared all the Divine Dungeons when I said that, but the game simply stopped being fun for me at that point, and ultimately, I went to go fight the final boss simply because my drive to continue playing the game was completely diminished. It's a dang shame, because Breath felt like it had the potential to be so much better. And who knows? Maybe there are some more redeeming qualities of this game, but if that's the case, then the game is just taking too long for my liking. 50 hours is short. I really wish I could have spent more time playing this game, but until that holiday DLC comes out, I don't have a desire to touch this game ever again. I really do feel like this game would have been better off as its own game, because the changes it made and the problems it contains just seem so not Zelda. The only way you could get me to play another gigantic Zelda game like this is if a company experienced with open world games, such as Monolith Soft, were to work on it. I'm not disliking Breath's changes because I wanted more of the same. Honestly, out of all the years that I've played Zelda games, there's only been one game that was a rehash, and that was A Link Between Worlds. What about games like the different at the time Ocarina of Time, or its more story-focused sequel Majora's Mask with a 3-day mechanic? Or what about Forces Adventures, the incredibly fast-paced, action-packed Zelda game that featured the ability to bludgeon enemies with whatever you grabbed, and manipulation of real-time locations, or the formation mechanic? I could list more, but these are just 3 examples. So to state my thoughts on this game in a more simplified way, as a Zelda game, I have played better. And even as an open world game, I have played better. Taking several steps backwards just to move a few steps in a different direction is just not a good idea. Overall, The Legend of Zelda 19, Breath of the Wild is, without a doubt, a disappointment.